All right. Thanking God for the way in which he turns, one of my favorite musicians says, a negative into a positive. Let's call Mark chapter 3, great denial, as the potentially great questions we saw in Mark chapter 2 are going to seem to take a turn south. We'll call it into great denial, as the Pharisees aren't going to be content to raise questions. They are now going to want to raise more rigid opposition, as this chapter, much like chapter 2, is going to mirror, for the most part, a single chapter in Matthew. This time, Mark chapter 3 is going to seem to mirror Matthew chapter 12, as verses 1 through 6 are going to describe the way in which Jesus is going to go into a synagogue on the Sabbath with, I think it is it literally the Pharisees this time? Who is it? Who is it? Yeah, Pharisees in verse 6, waiting to see if he's going to try to heal on the Sabbath. He is going to ask them the question, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill, helping them to understand something he's going to take more time to describe in Matthew's gospel, the way in which if they had an animal that had fallen into a pit on the Sabbath, much like we used in the cooking illustration on the Sabbath at the end of the last chapter, they'd have no problem going to pull that animal out of a pit. But the sad irony is they seem to have more compassion for their own animals than they have for God's people. Mark giving us a different perspective on that in verses 7 through 12, as it talks about the way that once again, great crowds gathered because of the great things that he was doing, not only healing, but as we see in verses 11 and 12, driving out the unclean spirits. As we kind of alluded to, but might not have clearly mentioned, it seems that he is dealing with not only their physical ailments, their body, but their mind. The teaching that he is doing is giving them a better understanding of how to stay out of the situations that got some of them in trouble in the first place. Understanding that one of the first questions he gets is, why is this man saying that he's forgiving sins? Understanding that there are some of these situations that are linked to the sins of the people, but he's also going to deal with their spiritual well-being. As we see here, once again, he is driving out the unclean spirits, as verses 13 through 19 describe the way that he gathers his 12, Mark specifically naming them or calling them apostles, going on to talk about the way that his growing popularity, once again, is going to be reflected in verse 20, the crowds gathering. However, it's going to create concern for his family because all of the drama around him is literally, in verse 21, going to cause them to think, or at least some around them to think, that he is out of his mind, causing his family concern, something that's going to pick up toward the end of the chapter. But before that, he is going to respond to a similar slander by the scribes, where verse 22 is going to pick up saying, and the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebub, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons, leading him to begin a very famous style of teaching in verse 23. And he called them to him and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? Going on to talk about the way that the spiritual realm actually works, far apart from what they might understand about it. Going on, though, he is going to issue the famous warning that all kinds of sins and blasphemies will be forgiven, but blasphemy against the Holy Spirit will not. Literally saying in verses 26 through 30, truly I say, all sins will be forgiven the children of man and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they were saying, he has an unclean spirit. Not going into the details of what that unforgivable sin or blasphemy is. We talked about it in Matthew 12, but Mark's version seems to give a more clear account of what that unforgivable sin is, saying he's literally telling them this because they are attributing the work of the Holy Spirit that is at work in him to an unclean spirit. He's giving us another example of why it's just wise to stay away from slander and backbiting in the first place. Understanding that James says, who can tame the tongue? It's one of those areas where it's so important to ask God to help us to at least want to tame the tongue so that he can come in and help us guide our speech into healthy places, as opposed to the kind of dangers in malicious and faulty speech that we see him warning about here. As the chapter is going to go on and conclude, with his family coming to see him, quite possibly a continuation of verse 21, where they were coming to seize him because some had begun to say he is out of his mind. It's going to lead to, once again, what we saw back in Matthew 12, him challenging them to understand who his actual mother and brothers, etc., are. When he is going to say in verse 33, and he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and my mother. Which might be an interesting contrast to the thing that I think caught my attention most in this chapter. That I think being something we saw in verse 5, where it says, and he looked around at them. Context being, when he was considering handling or healing the man with the withered hand on the Sabbath. It's going to say, and he looked around at them with anger. But the part that caught my attention was where it says, grieved at the hardness of their heart. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched out his hand, and his hand was restored. That phrase from verse 5, noticing the hardness of their hearts, reminding me why great denial seemed to be an appropriate theme for this chapter, understanding that in the middle of this chapter, unlike what we saw in Matthew's gospel, we're going to see him picking 12 apostles to essentially do all the things that the scribes, Pharisees, etc. would not do, quite possibly because of their great denial, reminding me of times in life when I have seen those of modest talents surpass those of great talents because of their refusal to adapt. And that is exactly what is going on, or seems to be going on here in Mark chapter 3. We're seeing a contrast between two groups. The apostles, famously outside of the standard of those considered to be talented or gifted in the ways of understanding the laws of Israel, about to surpass those who were considered to be among the elite in their understanding of God's law. Quite possibly giving us another perspective on Christ's warning back in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew that we cannot serve two masters. There it was God and money. But Mark chapter 3 may be showing us the way in which we cannot effectively both get even and get better, understanding that whatever abilities Christ's opposition might have, they're about to be surpassed by the abilities of his apostles, who, instead of focusing their attention on bickering with what Christ is counseling them to do, they're simply putting his wisdom to work on a path that has them set to max out their potential, avoiding the disappointment and failure that goes along with great denial.